Department of Homeland Security on the job, working, being paid, doing the training that needs to be done. Mr. President, it is astonishing that time and time again, whether it comes to the safety of our citizens, the security of our elections, Democrats once again put illegal immigrants first and American citizens last. Republicans and most Americans reject this far-left extremism of the Democrat Party. It offends so many. Republicans are going to continue to put American citizens first, at the border, in communities, and at the ballot box. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsterbrooks.
Democrat, quick.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are.
Ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we recently passed a tragic milestone, the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. I remember the morning vividly, sitting with Senator Coons, the senior senator from Delaware, on a dark early morning at the airport in Vilnius, Lithuania, a country that knows all too well the threat posed by Russia throughout history. The loss of life from Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been staggering, with nearly 2 million total casualties. Millions more Ukrainians have been displaced. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been abducted to Russia. President Trump bragged more times than I can remember that he would end the Ukrainian war on day one if reelected. To his credit, the United States has fostered a series of talks between Russia and Ukraine. While I strongly support American help to ensure Ukraine can defend itself, and a diplomatic resolution is always preferable, it's devastatingly clear to everyone, except it seems the president, that Putin isn't serious about reaching a peace deal in Ukraine. Putin continues to play for time, calling and manipulating President Trump at key moments, including last week, to brazenly offer help in the Middle East, while simultaneously we know Russia is giving intelligence to the Iranians to target American forces. Time and again, President Trump has only pressed Ukraine to reach a deal, never pressed Putin. And last week, Trump defied common sense when he lifted sanctions on Russian oil because of what should have been foreseen chaos in the energy markets due to his invasion in Iran. And for reasons I simply cannot explain, this chamber has refused to pass Russian sanctions legislation with more than 85 co-sponsors. Let me be clear, Putin only responds to strength. He is stringing along U.S.-led peace negotiations while relentlessly bombing Ukraine, while helping Iran target American service members. It's time for President Trump to finally learn this lesson, and for the Senate to pass legislation increasing pressure on Putin to negotiate. I yield the floor.
Minority Leader.
I understand that there are 4 bills at the desk due for a second reading en bloc.
The Leader is correct. The clerk will read the titles of the bills for the second time en bloc.
S4124, a bill to prohibit funds made available to the Department of Justice from being used to make a personal payment to the President in connection with a claim that is subject to the Federal Tort Claims Act and so forth. S4125, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to impose a tax on damages received by certain officers of the United States and so forth and for other purposes. S4126, a bill to address the ineligibility of Ashley Babbitt for military funeral honors.
In a minute.
S4127, a bill making continuing appropriations for essential transportation security administration, pay and operations, and so forth and for other purposes.
In order to place the bills on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding en bloc.
Objection having been heard, the bills will be placed on the calendar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, there are so many issues Senate Republicans could be working with us on this week that Americans actually care about. Republicans could focus on whether Americans can afford groceries, or on lowering health care premiums, or bringing down the child care costs, or fixing our power grid. But what have MAGA Republicans chosen to focus on this week? Voter suppression. That is what the Republican Senate is wasting our time on, pushing a voter suppression bill that most Americans do not support, a bill that appeals to only the most fringe element of the MAGA base. If this is the path our Republican colleagues want to take, Democrats are ready. We will hold the line to ensure the forces of voter suppression do not win the day. We will debate this bill for as long as Republicans want, because the more time we spend on this bill, the more Senate Democrats will expose it for what it really is. I heard our senator from Utah last night talk on the floor, and he talked, times I heard him, about having an ID when you go vote. This SAVE Act is not about voter ID. In fact, the original bill didn't even have a sentence about voter ID, and they had to put it in at the last minute so it could meet their subterfuge argument. Democrats support common sense voter ID, but this bill is not that, not at all. So don't lie and make it seem like that's the purpose of this bill, because it isn't. It's just a sentence that was added at the last minute so they could engage in this subterfuge. This is suppression, a MAGA power grab that could disenfranchise more than 20 million American citizens. Because what's the core of the bill? The core of the bill is handing the voter rolls over to DHS, putting them through an algorithm designed by Moj and Musk that supposedly knocks out illegal immigrants from voting. But the evidence is almost no illegal immigrants vote. And on an experiment in a county in Missouri, more than half the people knocked out were American citizens using this algorithm. Is that what the senators from Missouri or any other state want, their legitimate citizens being knocked off the ballot, being purged, and then not knowing about it until you show up to vote on Election Day and you say to the person at the election facility, well, I voted at this booth I voted at this place for 20 years. I've used the same ID. Well, you were knocked off. And to get back on is very onerous and very difficult. It's harder to re-register under this bill than it is to purchase a firearm. It's absolutely crazy. And it's all based on one fact, that Donald Trump has lied that our elections are rife with voter fraud. We know that's bull. Even the Wall Street Journal, no friend of Democrats, certainly no friend of mine, said in an editorial yesterday, the Wall Street Journal said the president's voter fraud claims aren't backed by hard evidence. And yet that's what this bill is supposedly all about. I hope every single Republican yesterday read the editorial in the Wall Street Journal, because they may not listen to us from this side of the aisle, but maybe they'll listen to the Journal. The SAVE Act makes voting harder and makes registration much harder for U.S. citizens. For U.S. citizens, the Journal notes many driver's licenses wouldn't comply, wouldn't qualify. So I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, do you want to tell your voters, your citizen voters, that if they move and have to re-register, it's much harder? I don't think so. The Journal makes another important point. He says the SAVE Act can't save Republicans from voter anger at unpopular policies. Let me say that again, Wall Street Journal editorial page, quote, it can't save Republicans from voter anger at unpopular policies. Even the Wall Street Journal seems to recognize why Donald Trump and MAGA radicals are so obsessed with this bill. They think it will save them from what other looks like a bad November, a November where voters are fed up with Trump's policies. That's what's going on here. If Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans are so worried about November, the answer shouldn't be to take away the vote. It should try to come up with policies that are popular. Rethink their awful policies that have made life more expensive and painful for working people. If Donald Trump and Republicans are worried about November, then maybe they should have focused on lowering costs instead of kicking millions of people off health care. Maybe Donald Trump should not have started an unpopular war in the Middle East with no plan on how to get out. Maybe MAGA Republicans should stand up to Donald Trump's tariffs. A lot of them didn't like them. A headline from AP today read, Trump's tariffs are hurting American manufacturers instead of helping them. That's from the AP. Of course, Trump will say we should get rid of the AP when they don't agree with him. That's another issue. Maybe Republicans should fight against Donald Trump's corruption, his lavish gifts, his pardoning of ultra-rich fraudsters, his administration's crypto get-rich-quick schemes. But instead of doing any of these things, instead of doing what Americans want Republicans to do, MAGA radicals instead are trying to take away the vote. They want to short-circuit the mechanisms of accountability that underpin our democracy. If MAGA Republicans want to waste this week and beyond on voter suppression, we're happy to have the debate. We're happy to show the American people how radical the SAVE Act is and how out of touch Republicans have become by wasting time on this bill instead of lowering costs like people want. How they're going to, with this bill, disenfranchise millions of their own voters, Republican voters in red states, by doing this bill. On Iran. Well, we're 3.5 weeks into Donald Trump's Iran war. And today the price of Brent crude hit nearly $110 a barrel. Experts say that even if the war ended tomorrow, it would take a long time for prices to come back down. We know oil prices are sticky for going down. When oil prices spike quickly, they tend to fall very slowly. And now central banks are worried that Trump's war is driving up costs not just for energy, but for transportation, for shipping, and other key goods that pass through Middle East. Mortgage rates, after inching down, are moving back up. And the worst part is there are no signs the war is going to end tomorrow, next week, or anytime soon. Donald Trump, the old saying is, if you break it, you buy it. Donald Trump's breaking the Middle East. But now he's trying to dodge the cost and leave the American people with the bill. So I will reaffirm again what Democrats have been saying for days. We need cabinet officials to testify because the story from the administration does not add up. This morning, before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard insisted in her prepared remarks that Donald Trump's operation from last year, Midnight Hammer, did in fact, she says, obliterate Iran's nuclear enrichment program. She noted there have been no efforts since then to try and rebuild their enrichment capability. So what gives now, Tulsi? Why did Donald Trump strike Iran again if you say that Midnight Hammer did in fact obliterate the nuclear enrichment program? And of course, nobody wants a nuclear Iran. Why do the American people still not have any clear answers on the goals and timeline of this war? Secretary Rubio needs to publicly testify under oath. He must answer tough questions from both sides of the aisle, which there will be, in public. Hegseth needs to testify publicly under oath. The American people deserve to directly hear from them. They deserve answers. They deserve accountability. And they need to hear from the administration about how we're going to get out of this before it's too late. And finally, on Markwayne Mullin, Senator Mullin. He's been testifying before the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs as President Trump's nominee to be the next Secretary of Homeland Security. I will not be supporting Senator Mullin's nomination should it come before the Senate. The problems at DHS, especially at ICE and CBP, run far deeper than who's in charge. What Americans need, far more than just a change in leadership, is a change in policy. Americans demand legislation to rein in ICE and end the violence. But the White House is still refusing to engage on some of the most pressing demands that Democrats have called for since day one. We're going to continue to engage the White House and congressional Republicans, but we need them to get serious about responding to the chaos we've seen in too many American cities. If ICE is not reformed and reined in, sooner or later another American citizen is at risk of getting killed. I yield the floor.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Just like to offer a few words of rebuttal to the Democrat leader. He talked about high oil prices. He didn't mention the fact when President Biden was in office and the Democrats were in charge, in June of 2022, the national average gas price reached almost $5 a gallon. That same month, inflation was 9.1%, a 40-year high. And again, that wasn't because President Biden was having to do something hard to take care of the menace that Iran was. President Biden was coddling Iran, pumping billions of dollars into their economy, into their military, into their proxies. Gasoline was $5 a gallon because of their war on fossil fuels, because of Democrat policies. So need to correct the record there. Second point I wanted to make is I heard the Democrat leader say that Democrats are, I think this is what he said, are in favor of common sense voter ID. Well, if that's the case, I'm sure we'd be happy to work with them to deliver that, because 80% of the American people agree with a picture ID to vote. 80%. It's the Democrats who refuse to put any kind of controls to ensure the security of our elections. But I think you completely mischaracterized what the senator from Utah's bill, the Save America Act, actually does. It's not going to make it harder to vote. It's going to make it harder to cheat, because Americans do not want their legitimate vote canceled by a fraudulent one. But we're going to actually, we've got this bill on the floor. We're going to be debating it. The way the Senate debates things is we offer amendments. Republicans will be offering amendments to add to it things that, again, the American people support with 60, 70, 80% majorities. But if Democrats actually have a constructive approach to a common sense ID that 80% of Americans would agree with, talk to us. My guess, Senator Lee, would be happy to clarify the legislation to prove the fact that we're not going to make it harder to vote. We're just going to make it more difficult to cheat. So again, this ought to be, from my standpoint, a very instructive, hopefully a very productive debate over the next number of days, maybe number of weeks. This is important. In 2016, Democrats were the ones that said it wasn't a legitimate election when Donald Trump first got elected. 4 years later, tables were turned. All of a sudden, the other half of America was saying it's not a legitimate election. This is an unsustainable state of affairs. The only way to cure it is for common sense election controls, to make sure that we have the integrity so that no matter who wins an election, both sides agree that that's a legitimate result. That's what we're trying to achieve as Republicans. Again, we don't want to see somebody's legitimate vote canceled by a fraudulent one. I think the fact that Democrats are opposed to virtually any, probably all, election integrity measures just proves they want to make it easy to cheat. And I'll throw in one final comment. The Baker-Carter Commission, I would call it a completely nonpartisan commission that looked at our election system and tried to identify, how can we make it as secure as possible? The one area of our elections that they thought was the greatest opportunity for fraud was absentee and mail-in balloting. So with that, in light of that fact, what did Democrats do during COVID? They took advantage of that situation and literally doubled the number of absentee ballots, while certainly in my state, in the state of Wisconsin, there were all kinds of irregularities in terms of ballots being cured by election clerks, which is not lawful, balloting in the park, improper assisting of seniors in nursing homes. There are all kinds of irregularities that, in the end, were never adjudicated. Like some of the court cases in the 2020 election, they were just thrown out of court, dismissed, because, let's face it, our judicial system really doesn't want to get involved in elections. I don't fault them for that, but it's just a reality situation. So again, what this debate is about is making sure that every American has the confidence that their legitimate vote will not be canceled by a fraudulent one. That's what Republicans want to do. We want to make it easy to vote, but almost impossible to cheat. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Hey, how are you? Good. Nice to see you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Republican majority representing the views of the President here on the floor of the Senate are trying to engage not in a save democracy, but to steal democracy movement. That is what this entire debate is about. It's about a great fear, which the Republicans have, that because of their health care policies that are raising the price for health care for Americans across our country, because of the anger which Americans have, a dramatic spike in the price of oil and gas and home heating oil, that voters are angry across our country, that voters across our country are angry at the rise in the price for food across our nation, that voters are angry that there is a dramatic spike in the concern which Americans have about the arresting and incarceration of innocent citizens in our country who have no previous criminal records, that all of this is a part of an attempt by the Republicans to steal the election of 2026. They are afraid that they are going to go to the minority, that they will lose their power. And they know that the only way they can win now is if they steal the election. So this should not be called the SAVE Act, it should be called the Steal Act, because they are going to try to suppress the votes, especially of black and brown citizens in our country. They are going to attempt to make it very difficult for them to vote, and then as a result, they're hoping, with their fingers crossed, that they can win a very narrow election in 2026 in our country. So democracy is on the line, and the SAVE Act, misnamed, is a direct attack upon our abilities to have free and fair elections in our nation. They want to make it very difficult for people to be able to register to vote. They want to make it very difficult for people to be able to actually vote on election day. That's their goal. Their goal is to suppress the vote, not to make it easier to vote in our nation. And rather than working with Democrats on this issue, they're just going my way or the highway. They're just going in a direction which tries to save the Republican majority this year. The SAVE Act is save the majority for the Republicans. That is right now in serious jeopardy. And even today, we see that the latest news is attacks upon further Iranian natural gas fields, which is leading to a further spike in the price for oil and gas and home heating oil in the United States of America. People are being shaken upside down at the pumps in our country. People are now paying upwards of 90 cents or a buck more for a gallon of gasoline. And that's going to mean over the course of a year, $400, $500 more out of the pockets of every American family. It's a tax. This war that is illegally and unconstitutionally being run by Trump in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, is a tax, first on Americans who will have to pay for that war in higher taxes, then as they hit the pump or pay their home heating oil bill or the natural gas bill or their electricity bill, they're going to pay another tax in terms of the higher price that they have to pay, on top of the price for lost lives. That's the highest price of all. And those lives are being lost in the conduct of an illegal war. And it's all now coming back to our homeland. It's all coming back to the price of oil, of electricity, of natural gas, of home heating oil that every American family is going to have to pay. The only way to solve this problem is to end that war. Because as the price of a barrel of oil goes from $70 a barrel to $80 a barrel to $90 a barrel to $110 a barrel, that then gets translated at the pump into $3.40 a gallon, $3.80 a gallon, $4 a gallon, $4.20 a gallon. And it's just going to continue to rise and rise and rise as long as this war continues. So it is absolutely imperative that Trump ends this war, because families at home are paying the price. And it's directly translatable into every single product which is purchased in our country, from food to the price of airline tickets to the price of transporting on trucks every single good across our country. That gets built into the price for everything that people are going to be buying this year. And so all I can say is that's what we should be debating out here. We should be debating that war. We should be debating the impact which it is having upon our economy. The stark difference between the priorities of both parties is on display here on the Senate floor right now. The Republicans are trying to suppress the vote so that voters are going to have a more difficult time in reflecting their views on Election Day this year on this dramatic spike in home heating oil and gasoline and electricity, natural gas prices in our country. They don't want people to be able to easily vote on that. They don't want people to be able to easily vote on the fact that 22 million Americans have seen a dramatic spike in the premium for their health care insurance in our nation. They don't want it to be easy at all for people to be able to vote on the price of food, the effect which naming the head of the World Wrestling Federation to be the head of the Department of Education is having upon children's ability to get access to the education they need in every city and town in our nation. The destruction of the Department of Education. That's cascading down into every community as well. That's reducing funding and requiring communities to talk about raising taxes at the local level. All of that is what we should be debating out here on the floor. And what the Republicans are saying is, no, we want to debate about suppression of the vote, reducing the number of people who can easily access the ballot box this fall in order to express their views on all of their policies. So that's really why we're here today. We're here in order to witness the Republicans' lack of priorities, their lack of focus upon the issues which the American people care most about. Gasoline prices, electricity prices, natural gas prices, home heating oil prices, as they watch every day this dramatic rise in those prices as a result of the war in the Persian Gulf, the war illegally declared by Donald Trump, with an escalation again today. Because every time they hit all of those energy facilities in the Middle East, we pay the price. Every consumer, every family pays the price at their kitchen table as they're trying to figure out their payment of the bill that they are responsible to pay for their family, for energy in our country. So that's what we should be debating. And it should be an all-out debate. And we should be having the hearings on this issue. We're not having those hearings. We're not having that debate. The only thing that the Republicans want to talk about is the suppression of the vote, especially in minority communities, and especially in the states that have the highest probability of electing Democratic senators and House members this year. That is what this is all about. It's why Trump tried to cut a deal with Minneapolis on the day that Alex Preddy was murdered, and the White House, his administration said to Minnesota, if you give us access to your voting rolls, then we'll negotiate with you on pulling ICE out. And then they sent in Tulsi Gabbard into Georgia just to try to grab all the election materials at Fulton County. All is a prelude to, as the president says, the invocation of the Insurrection Act, which means the activation of the Marines and the Army in order to be deployed on Election Day in 2026 to suppress the vote. And we know where he wants to do that, in the states that they're most afraid of losing this year to the Democratic Party. And when he talks about the nationalization of elections, of course, it's in complete violation of the United States Constitution, which gives that power to the states. So we're heading towards a constitutional crisis later on this year. Donald Trump is a walking, talking constitutional crisis, roaming around the Oval Office every single day, trying to figure out how to avoid any accountability, any checks and balances that would be imposed by the United States Congress or by the Supreme Court upon his actions. That is where we are right now. That is the status of the United States of America. And that's why Democrats are going to be standing up and making this case to the American people that they're trying to suppress the vote in order to protect all of the impacts which their misbegotten policies have had upon ordinary families in our country. They're living with the consequences economically at home. And the Republicans today, by their actions with their attempt to pass their Steal the Election Act, are trying to make it very difficult for the American people to make the Republican Party accountable. So, Mr. President, with that, I yield back.
Mr. President,
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I'm so grateful for the remarks of my colleague and friend from the great state of Massachusetts and for his voice on this very important issue. I rise today as a child of the civil rights movement, as the blessed beneficiary of its bold moral witness in America, and as a member of only the second generation of our nation to have full and fair access to the right to vote. Some have argued that in a real sense, our country did not really become a democracy until 1965, when there were those who stood up with courage and challenged the nation to live up to its ideals. I stand here today and I'm able to work in this building on behalf of the people of Georgia. What an honor to represent 11 million people, to carry on this grand experiment called democracy. But it's never far from my memory that at the time of my birth, Georgia's two senators were Richard B. Russell and Herman E. Talmadge. In many ways, they were effective. They brought great things back to the state of Georgia, but we would not be honest. We would not be telling the full story if we did not remember that they were both arch segregationists and unabashed adversaries of the civil rights movement, which sought to expand the electorate, to ensure that this is a house where every American citizen has a voice. Senator Talmadge once said, "We love the Negro in his place, and his place is at the back door." Well, it is a testament to the greatness of this country that I sit in his seat, because there were those who stood up to fight for the highest ideals of our country. I reference that history because it is relevant in this moment. Nearly 62 years ago to the day, those two Georgia senators, along with other Southern senators, began a weeks-long effort to prevent people who look like me and my parents and my children from fully participating in our democracy. They were trying to narrow the electorate. And so I find it interesting and ironic that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have been leading this effort dared in recent days to reference this very history, which is the cause for my being here in the first place. One of them pointed out the fact that when we entered the debate about the civil rights legislation and trying to push it into law, that there were those who stood up day after day, week after week. And he dared to enlist that history as if somehow that was some inspiration for what they are trying to do in this moment. Let me be very clear. You are on the other side of that history. You're on the side of those who are trying to narrow the electorate. And so if you want to pass the SAVE Act, that is your prerogative. If you want to argue that folks have to have a birth certificate or a passport just to be able to register to vote in a country where most Americans do not have a passport, if you want to effectively disenfranchise women, disenfranchise poor people, working class people who have to struggle for the right to vote, that is your prerogative. But be very clear, you are not on the side of the movement, you're on the other side of that history. Fight for this if you will. But you ought to leave the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr.'s name out of your mouth. This country goes through moments where the electorate expands, and then it goes through moments when it contracts. And we're in a contraction moment. We're in a moment where, in the words of the administration itself, it was a cabinet official in the White House herself who said that we just want to make sure that, quote, the right people are voting. The right people. The right people are voting. That was the argument in the 1960s. And had those who wanted to make sure that the, quote, right people were voting, had they prevailed, I would not be standing here today. I don't believe in the right people. I believe in we the people. We the people. We the people. That is not just the first three words of our charter document. It is a creed. We the people. Every American citizen must have access to the franchise, and it must not be treated as a privilege. It is a right. And when you put up unnecessary barriers, you undermine that basic understanding that the franchise is not a privilege, it's a right. I often say that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children. And our prayers are stronger when we pray together. There are no right or wrong people. There's only the American people. And they put up this SAVE Act arguing that they want to make sure that it's only Americans who are voting, but they have demonstrated, they have provided no evidence that voter fraud is a real thing through voter identification. We know that this will disenfranchise thousands, if not millions, of Americans. We have no evidence that this is a problem that actually needs to be solved, and yet they have shut down much of the business of the Senate in order to do this. They are hell-bent on getting this done. Donald Trump said that this is his number one priority, and so it begs the question, why is this his number one priority? With all the things going on in our country, why is this the main thing that he feels he must get done? Why is he afraid? I'll tell you why. It's because that he knows that he has broken every promise he made. He said that he was going to lower your costs. Instead, he's doubled health care premiums for 22 million Americans. His tariffs have cost the average family over $1,000 a year. Gas prices are spiking and show no sign of coming down anytime soon, but this is his number one priority. He said he was going to be the president of peace, but he has attacked 17 countries and counting. And yet again, we find ourselves entangled in another endless war with no end game and no idea of what victory even looks like. All the while, we have important problems right here at home. Donald Trump promised to support our farmers, and instead he's raised the cost of fertilizer and hamstrung their exports. And farmers all across Georgia are suffering as a result. And so that's really what this is all about. Donald Trump is a failed president, and his support is collapsing. I hear it all across Georgia, in rural towns bearing the brunt of the president's immigration policies and farmers dealing with the realities of a trade war. This president claims to be America first, but in the name of protecting United States citizens, his deportation machine has seized over 170 citizens. They've shot and killed 2 American citizens on a quiet street. I went to stand where they lost their lives. In a real sense, I felt like I was standing on holy ground. Ground made sacred by the blood of patriots who stood up against abusive authority under the color of law, to remind us that at the end of the day, this is our country. We the people. We the people. Not the powerful interests who can write big checks to keep politicians in office. We the people. Not the lobbyists. We the people. Not the American oligarchs, we the people. And now they want to prevent even more citizens from voting, from making our voices heard. They want to block our ability to stand up in November and say enough is enough. And so the president is panicking. He's doing what he always does. He's attacking our elections so that you cannot fire his foot soldiers in Congress. It is pathetic. He looks to me like a scared human being who knows that behind the curtain is a tiny man. We will not be intimidated. Our voices will not be silenced. The president continues to push the lies that he spread after he lost in 2020 to create the pretext to interfere in the midterm elections. That's why we saw an FBI raid in Fulton County, Georgia. And as I watched that FBI raid, I saw the director of national intelligence crouched in a corner, talking on a mobile phone. And I wondered, why was she there? There were bomb threats in polling stations in poor and black neighborhoods during the 2024 election, which was later traced back to Russian interference. Still waiting on an answer from her on that. There she was, engaged in this effort to count the ballots again in the 2020 election, even after the president's own Justice Department found no evidence of meaningful voter fraud. These claims about voter fraud, that's the fraud. That's the fraud. And I think Americans are growing tired of it. You know, the wonderful thing about our country, Mr. President, is that we get to have the argument. You and I don't agree on a whole range of things, but I just want us to be able to have the argument. It gets rambunctious in the American public square to avoid violence. But at the end of the day, everybody gets to go to the polls. And the most powerful words in a democracy are "the people have spoken." And so I will always cast my lot on the side of democracy. I'm hopeless in this regard. I believe in the people. I want to make sure my constituents' voices are heard, all of my constituents, even when they don't agree with me, even when I don't get the outcome that I want. When I think about the nature of human power and human pride, and forgive me, but I'm a preacher after all, human sin, our desire to make sure that we slant things so that we get the outcome we want. We see it not just in governments, you see it in your own family. The question becomes, how do you balance all of those things? I think democracy is the best we've got. Given who we are as human beings, I will cast my lot with the people's voice. Even when I think they've gotten it wrong, I would rather put my trust there. Reinhold Niebuhr perhaps put it best. He said that humankind's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Our capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. At the end of the day, the thing that can fix it, whatever issue we have, I believe is the people's voice. And so I'm disturbed about what I'm witnessing. I'm disturbed about an attack on Fulton County and in Maricopa County, Arizona. It troubles me when ICE lands in Minneapolis and then the administration says that we are there to deal with violent criminals, we are there to deal with this immigration issue. But then when it comes down to it, the administration says, do you really want ICE out of your community? Hand over your voter rolls. Come on, man. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican. Come on, you can see what this is about. What do the voter rolls have to do with violent criminals? What kind of ransom note is that to send to the leaders of the people of Minneapolis? And so the big lie continues to live. And we need to kill it once and for all. And the only thing that can do that is the people's voice. The president continues to spread conspiracy theories and outright lies. Here's the reality. This bill will disenfranchise thousands, if not millions, of Americans. And that is why they want to pass it so desperately. They are using onerous citizenship verification as a pretext for voter suppression, requiring you to use a birth certificate or a passport to register to vote. And under this bill, a driver's license wouldn't be enough to register to vote. They ought to call the bill what it is. They ought to call it a driver's license is not good enough act. They call it the SAVE Act, but the question is, what are they trying to save? They are not trying to save our elections. They are trying to save their own power at any cost. At the cost of the voices of ordinary people. Let's think about this in practical terms. If you change addresses, even if you move down the street, and you've been voting for years, do you want to have to track down your birth certificate, which you lost while you were moving, in order to register to vote? You get married and you change your name, you got to go find your marriage license and a birth certificate or a passport to prove that you are a citizen. More than half of Georgians, or 5.4 million people, lack a valid passport. And as many as 2.2 million women in Georgia may not have a birth certificate that matches their current legal name. And so women are disproportionately disenfranchised by this piece of legislation, which again is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist. Let me be really clear. Non-citizens should never vote in our elections. There's no argument about that. But this legislation will only make it harder for eligible American voters to make their voices heard. That is the actual work that this legislation will do. We know that about 760,000 voting-age Georgians who are United States citizens would have difficulty showing documentation proving their citizenship. We know that. By the way, we have voter ID in Georgia. And I will tell you for the record that I think you should have to prove that you are who you say you are before you vote. I support voter ID. We have voter ID laws in my state. You should have to prove that you are who you say you are before you vote. That's basic, but that is not what this is about. This is about onerous voter ID requirements used as a pretext and as a tool for voter suppression. Because there are those in the administration who want to make sure, quote, the right people vote. There are currently strong laws on the books that keep non-citizens from voting. They face criminal prosecution and deportation if they vote. So let's just think about the risk-reward analysis, the cost-benefit analysis. You will be criminally prosecuted if you try to vote and you are not a citizen. And you're trying to tell me that folks will risk criminal prosecution in droves to change the potential outcome of an election? Are you trying to tell me that folk will try to vote twice? It's hard enough to get folks to vote once, let alone twice. And that's probably why Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger found only 20 instances of non-citizens registered out of 8.2 million in Georgia. 8.2 million people registered to vote in Georgia. The Republican Secretary of State found 20 instances of non-citizens who were registered, and only 9 had ever attempted to vote. And the majority did so before 2012. This is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist. And so this means that the, quote, Save America Act would burden or disenfranchise over 150,000 Georgians for every single instance of a non-citizen voting in the last decade. Does that make sense? You keep one non-citizen from voting, you disenfranchise 150,000 for every one? You're trying to tell me that that makes the democracy stronger? More representative of our interests? And so if there's no meaningful voter fraud, and if this law is so disastrous for voting citizens, the question is, why is the president so desperate to sign the Save America Act into law? And I mean, he's desperate. So desperate that he's threatened his own Republican caucus, said, if y'all don't do this, we're not going to do anything. The president is trying to take away your right to vote so he can hold on to power. And Washington Republicans are trying to help him do it. They're using the Save America Act as a pretext for voter suppression. They know their policies are deeply unpopular with the American people, but instead of working to change their policies, instead of working to get more people access to the health care that they need, they're taking health care away from 15 million Americans. Instead of working to lower the cost of groceries, they're instituting reckless tariff taxes that make everything more expensive. Instead of actually working on behalf of the American people, they're working to change who can vote in the next election. And so we're going to stand up. I'm certainly going to stand up for all of my constituents. And I mean that. I want the Georgians who are in red districts to know that I'm fighting for you and your voice. Because this administration's so-called Save America Act will disenfranchise many of my constituents in red districts. And that is because increasingly the people's voices are being squeezed out of their democracy. It is the folks with a lot of money. It is the corporate interests that they want to hear from. And you are living right now with what happens when your voice is diminished. I see it. I see it in rural red counties that I visit all the time, where their rural hospital is either closed or it's almost near closing. Because they cut $1 trillion out of Medicaid. I see it in the eyes of farmers who are burdened by these tariff taxes and how it's creating damage and wreckage for their businesses. I saw it the other day in Social Circle, Georgia, where the administration is determined to put a 10,000 bed ICE detention center in a town of 5,000 people. 5,000 people in Social Circle, Georgia. The administration went in, bought a warehouse for $128 million. And the mayor, the city manager, the leadership of Social Circle, Georgia, learned that there would be a detention center in their town that would triple the size of their town by reading about it in the Washington Post. So think about that. The mayor elected to represent his people. The big bad federal government comes in under cover of night and ambushes the duly elected local officials because they didn't want to hear their voice. They were determined to bring this warehouse to their town whether they like it or not. And so I'm fighting for those people. Even though it's by and large a red district, I don't have a lot of votes in Social Circle, Georgia, but I'm a pastor first. And I told the people of Georgia that I would fight for them, even that I would walk with them even as I work for them. And so this is about the voices of ordinary people. This is about saving our democracy. As I close, and nobody believes a Baptist preacher when he says, as I close. But I'm not trying to break any records today. Andrew Young tells me the story that when they passed the Civil Rights Bill into law, Dr. King and his lieutenants went to see President Johnson. And the president was feeling good, and he should. They passed the Civil Rights Bill into law after that long filibuster that I talked about at the beginning of this speech. They passed the Civil Rights Bill into law, and Dr. King and his lieutenants went to see the president. And Dr. King said, I'm glad we got that Civil Rights Bill into law. And without skipping a beat, he said, now we need a voting rights law. He wasn't going to let the president bask too long in the glory of that victory. He said, that's great, but my people can't vote in the South. I need a voting rights law, and I need it yesterday. The president said to Martin Luther King Jr., you're right, I get it, but I just can't get that done right now. I don't have the power. And they left the meeting, and the staff was feeling all demoralized and dejected, and they said to Dr. King, what are we going to do? The president said, he doesn't have the power. Dr. King just sort of shrugged his shoulder and said, well, if the president doesn't have the power, I guess we're going to have to go and find him some. Think about that. He's just a Baptist preacher, wasn't elected to anything. He was not a United States senator, certainly not the president of the United States. But he said, we're going to go and find the president some power. Dr. King understood, and those who were around him understood, that it's not about the people in power, it's about the power that's in the people. And so the people are standing up in this moment, and I'm standing with them. No to the so-called SAVE Act, yes to saving our democracy. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
I very much appreciate the Reverend Senator Warnock and his reminder that questions about voting in America are moral questions, They are historic questions. They are questions about our democracy. And I am grateful for his leadership on this. And I hope all of us have a chance, if we didn't get to hear the speech the first time around, that we get to replay it and listen to what he has to say. Donald Trump is trying to stop American citizens from voting. Why? Because he knows his agenda is unpopular and that Republicans can't win based on what he's doing. So he wants to rig the election by picking his own voters. And that is what the SAVE Act is all about. Don't let Trump and the Republicans in Congress fool you. They'll say things like, hey, you have to show an ID to vote. You should have to show an ID to vote, just like you have to do to buy a beer. But this is not an ordinary voter ID bill. This is not a bill that says everybody either has to show a driver's license or a student ID to vote. This is a way to keep American citizens from voting, and I will just give you one example around this. If this bill passes, then in 45 of the 50 states, your driver's license won't count as a valid ID. And then it gets better. Let's say you're a married woman who lives in Massachusetts, and let's say that when you got married, you took your husband's name. Well, when you go to the polls to vote, you can't register by showing them your updated driver's license. Why? Because Massachusetts is one of the 45 states where a driver's license does not prove citizenship. So you bring along your birth certificate, shows you were born in the United States. Can you vote now? Nope. Your birth certificate is still under your maiden name. So yeah, you can use a passport if you have one, but remember, fewer than half of all Americans have a passport, and it costs $165 to get one, and it takes a month or two if everything is working on time. No passport and no birth certificate that matches your driver's license, well, Trump and the Republicans say you're just out of luck. And that's just one example of how this bill will actually make it harder for Americans to vote. Here's another deeply disturbing thing about this bill. It would require states to hand over sensitive information about voters to Trump's Department of Homeland Security, so that some shadowy guys can do whatever they want with it. Maybe they take you off the voter rolls. Maybe they use that information for something else. The point is, nobody really knows what will happen. This is an agency whose former leader, Kristi Noem, said just a few weeks ago, quote, "We need to make sure that we have the right people voting." So just make a guess. Who's going to get swept off the voter rolls? People that the Republicans think are likely to vote Democratic. So sweep off black people, sweep off brown people, sweep off women, sweep off students, sweep off people in precincts that voted Democratic last time, sweep off people that you think might vote Democratic in the upcoming election. I've heard this bill called Jim Crow 2.0, harking back to the days in the South when the South blocked black people from being able to vote with a whole series of tests and barriers so that they just wouldn't have a chance to vote. The Trump bill is Jim Crow 2.0. Non-citizen voting is extremely rare in America, and Republicans know that. They've seen the same data that we have. Voter roll audits in Georgia prior to the 2024 election found only 20 registered non-citizens out of 8.2 million saying he was president of peace. He lied. The U.S. is spending at least $1 billion a day on war with Iran. If we put the money that we're using at war with Iran toward health care, we could lower costs for millions of Americans. Just this week, Donald Trump's own energy secretary said out loud, quote, "We were very aware that we would cause a little bit of increased prices on Americans." Think about that. Trump and his top officials knew that this war would raise costs for Americans, and they did it anyway. In just the first 6 days of the war, the Trump administration spent an estimated $11.3 billion. That was in 6 days. We also lost 3 F-15 aircraft in just those first few days. That'll cost us another $300 million. And estimates say that the Trump administration has kept burning about $1 billion, taxpayer dollars, a day on the war in Iran. And now we are on day 18. Some estimates look more like $2 billion a day. That's over $23,000 every second. Something like $11.5 million since I started this speech. So let's look at Trump's warmongering by the numbers. $11.3 billion, the estimated cost of the first 6 days of Trump's war. $5.6 billion, the cost of munitions spent by the Pentagon in the first 2 days of the war. $300 million, the cost to replace 3 F-15s lost to friendly fire in the first week of the war. $50 billion, how much the Trump administration says it wants to add to an already massively inflated defense budget to pay for a war that was never authorized by Congress. $1 trillion, the Pentagon's budget this year. $1.5 trillion, the total amount that Trump is reportedly requesting for the Pentagon budget for next year. That means Republicans in Congress want to increase the Pentagon's budget by $500 billion. Now, to put these numbers in context, the Trump administration will spend $30 billion in just the first 30 days of the war. That is exactly how much we could have used to lower costs for millions of people for an entire year, people who got knocked off their health care or saw their premiums go up because of Trump's health care cuts. So instead of going to war with Iran, we could lower health care costs and actually save lives here at home. Here's one more, $12 billion, a number we've already passed. $12 billion is what it would cost to restore the expanded child tax credit for 1 year. So in less than 2 weeks of Donald Trump's war, we spent the same amount of money that would have lifted millions of kids out of poverty. For the same amount the U.S. is burning on just one single day of Donald Trump's reckless war with Iran, we could provide a full year's worth of food assistance for nearly 500,000 Americans, or Medicaid coverage for 300,000 children. But there's one more thing we could have done with the $12 billion the Trump administration has spent on war with Iran. We could have provided housing assistance for around 1 million Americans. We could have lowered prescription drug costs for tens of millions of people. We could have paid the entire National Park Service for more than 3 years. We could have given Pell Grants to 1.6 million students so they could afford to go to college. We could have provided retirement and disability pay for veterans wounded in combat and still had plenty of money left over. We could have helped pay the salaries of more than 100,000 teachers and nurses, 2 jobs that are crucial and where we've seen shortages. We could have funded Direct File, the program that lets Americans file their taxes online and for free. We could have funded that for 2 whole decades. We could have provided humanitarian assistance for countries around the world for almost 3 full years. That is a huge amount of money. And I want to talk about one more thing we could be spending taxpayer money on instead of Trump's reckless war in Iran, making child care more affordable for families. Here's the thing. People have been getting child care all wrong. Child care costs are painfully high. Right now, families are having to choose between breaking the budget, being forced to cut back on work hours, or settling for lower quality care just to ensure that their kids have a safe place to be while the parents are working. In 49 of the 50 states, families pay more for child care for their 2 kids than they do for rent. And the reason why costs are so high is that right now people think of child care as a privilege or as a service that's for sale. That is wrong. We should be thinking of universal child care as basic public infrastructure. We should be thinking about it the same way we think about roads and highways. Why? Because for this country to work, we need to care for our kids. And when parents don't have child care, they can't go to work. Investing in universal child care is also good for our kids' development, and it is good for our economy. We need affordable child care just as much as we need schools to educate our workers and bridges to connect goods to the market. It's basic infrastructure to make this country run. It is the infrastructure we need to thrive. And up until now, our nation just hasn't been thinking about child care that way. This is why we need to invest in child care for every family. You know, it's just basic supply and demand. There are a whole bunch of families that need child care, but there are a whole lot fewer child care workers. Normally, when we want to attract more workers to an area, we just pay them more. But child care prices are already sky high, and families just can't afford it. So where does that leave us? There's a huge gap that the federal government needs to fill. Imagine if the federal government didn't invest in roads and bridges, we just wouldn't have them. And that's what's happening with child care. And it's why we need to invest in universal child care and raise wages for child care workers. They should at least make the same amount as local public school teachers. In the wealthiest country on this planet, access to affordable, high-quality child care and early childhood education should not be a privilege reserved for the rich. It should be a right. But instead of talking about lowering child care costs, Donald Trump is delivering a punch to the gut to every parent struggling with those costs. Donald Trump is spending billions of dollars a week bombing Iran for reasons he cannot explain, but he cannot find a nickel to help the millions of people who are struggling to pay for health care, groceries, or child care. But this is a 1-2 punch. The Trump administration is spending a tremendous amount of money on war, and the war is also driving up costs for Americans. Take the price of gasoline over the past month. For months, Donald Trump has been saying gas prices are going down. He has been loud and proud about it. Right now, the average price for gas is more than $3.70 a gallon, more than 80 cents higher per gallon than just 1 month ago when Donald Trump started this war. That's more than a 25% increase in gas prices in a single month, which Donald Trump called a very small price to pay. Whoa, spoken like a billionaire. We have not seen gas prices jump this much since Russia attacked Ukraine. And now Donald Trump's war is choking off the Strait of Hormuz. That's where about 1/5 of the world's oil and natural gas supply comes through. And right now, it's all bottled up. So what does that mean? Trump's war with Iran means gas prices are skyrocketing for American families here at home. And Donald Trump's response? If they rise, they rise. In other words, he just doesn't care. Here's another one. Food prices. About a third of the world's fertilizer goes through that same Strait of Hormuz, and the prices jumped up by 30% in the days after Trump started this war. One U.S. farmer even said his fertilizer suppliers are warning that they just can't get the fertilizer. It's not only the price has gone up, it just literally is not available. So you've got all this fertilizer that can't go through the Strait of Hormuz, can't make it to our farmers here in America. And without that fertilizer, the farmers say they just can't plant as much food this year. And what's that going to mean? It means food prices will go up. So that's gasoline, that's food. But the prices of clothes, of technology, basically anything that's moved around by trucks that use gasoline or diesel, the prices for all of those goods will go up as well. Diesel prices are already up by more than 25%, raising the cost of shipping goods, including Amazon packages and food, nationwide. And jet fuel prices have shot up by 58% since Trump started the war. Airlines are passing these costs on to consumers by pushing ticket prices up even higher. Donald Trump's war with Iran is gearing up to become another forever war that burns billions of taxpayer dollars and makes life even more expensive for Americans here at home. This is a war that the American people do not want and did not ask for, but they're the ones who are footing the bill. And what does Trump administration have to say about that? Well, listen to Trump's top economic advisor. He said, quote, if the war were to be extended, it wouldn't really disrupt the U.S. economy very much at all. It would hurt consumers, and we'd have to think about what we'd want to do about that. But that's really the last of our concerns right now. Consumers, the last of our concerns. Higher prices for your family, the last of our concerns, according to the Trump administration. Look, you don't need to wonder why prices are going up. The Trump administration has said the quiet part out loud. The higher costs for American families are the last of the concerns for the Trump administration, and they can't even be bothered to worry about lowering costs for the American people. Lie number 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6. Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and other top Trump officials just can't keep their story straight. They have no clear plan and for weeks have failed to tell the American people what the goals are for this war and when this war will end. First, Trump said the war would be over in 4 to 5 weeks. Okay, that was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Trump has said all of these things. The war is won. The U.S. still needs to finish the job. The operations could end soon. The military may need to go further. Every hour, the Trump administration's justification for this war sounds completely different. Why did the U.S. strike Iran? On March 2nd, Pete Hegseth said it was to end a 47-year war. The same day, Hegseth said it's because Iran refused to negotiate. And in another comment on the same day, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said it was a response to Israel planning to strike. And then, on the same day, Donald Trump said it had nothing to do with Israel planning to strike. Donald Trump said, quote, if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand. Rubio then said Iran would have, quote, so many short-range missiles in a year. That's the reason to initiate the war. 2 days later, Trump says the reason why the U.S. struck Iran is because he had, quote, a good feeling that Iran would strike U.S. assets and our personnel in the region. Look, there's just one story after another, and none of them add up. How can the American people trust this government when this government can't even keep its own story straight? And the Trump administration clearly has no plan for how this war will end. On the very first day of the war, Trump called the attacks, quote, major combat operations in Iran. A week later, Trump called it, quote, short-term excursion that were, quote, getting very close to finishing. And what's the goal? The administration has no clue. On day one of the war, Trump told the American people he had to attack Iran because Iran posed an imminent threat based on their nuclear capabilities. But remember, last June, Trump bombed Iran and claimed that Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities had been, quote, completely and totally obliterated. Both of those things cannot be true at the same time. And understand this, if Trump believes that Iran's nuclear ambitions are a threat, then he had a chance to curb them. In fact, the United States had a deal that could have prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That was President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, and Trump ripped up that deal, and here's the best part, got nothing in return. So instead of doing the hard work of diplomacy to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, Trump lies to the American people while dragging us into yet another reckless war that is costing American lives. If you can believe it, Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth have even given conflicting takes on whether or not this war is over. On March 8th, Hegseth said, quote, this is only just the beginning. The next day, March 9th, Trump said the war is, quote, complete, pretty much. But he also said, quote, you could say both, very complete and just the beginning. Trump also said, quote, that we haven't won enough and that we will, quote, go further. But just days later, he said, quote, we won. The first hour, it was over. And then he said, quote, we don't want to leave early, do we? We've got to finish the job. Then last week, Trump said, we're ramping up strikes. How long will this war go on? Well, one day after the war, Trump said, quote, 4 to 5 weeks. The same day, Hegseth said, quote, more or less than 2, 4, or 6 weeks. And then he added, quote, it could move up, it could move back. Then Hegseth said, quote, we'll go as far as we need to go to advance American interest. On March 10th, Hegseth said, it's up to Trump. He said, quote, our will is endless. Ultimately, the president gets to determine the end state of those objectives. On March 11th, Trump said the war with Iran will end, quote, soon. Look, this is not a game. This administration is sending young Americans to die overseas. And that means our government leaders need to treat this conflict with life and death seriousness. Instead, they don't even have the decency to level with the American people. Yet another lie from the Trump administration was about the horrific U.S. military strike on an elementary school in the early days of the war. Last week, a preliminary investigation by the Department of Defense confirmed that it is likely that it was our own military that bombed a girls' school in Iran. This is one of the most devastating military mistakes in decades. 175 people were killed. Most of them were children. Now, before the investigation, Trump said over and over that the attack was done by Iran. But even after the investigation, Trump kept lying to the American people. He said, quote, he didn't know about the investigation, an investigation done by his own military on one of the most horrific military mistakes in recent history. And remember, Pete Hegseth gutted the office that was in charge of preventing civilian harm. How do I know? I led the charge to establish that office in the first place. Hegseth is also purging the military's legal experts, the people who act as legal guardrails, and ordered a, quote, ruthless overhaul to make sure that no one else who might question him is left standing. It is a betrayal of our service members and a betrayal of the American people that we still have no answers and no accountability. So what would accountability look like here? Well, for starters, Pete Hegseth should be fired immediately. Hegseth's long pattern of chaos and incompetence has put our service members and the American people at risk. And we haven't even scratched the surface of Signalgate or Hegseth's role in the boat strikes that could be war crimes. Pete Hegseth has got to go, and he needs to go now. Now, the basic story here is pretty straightforward. Working families are struggling to pay for basic needs like groceries, housing, healthcare, electricity, and now prices are shooting up even higher because of Donald Trump's new war in Iran. Donald Trump's dangerous actions overseas are making everyday life both more expensive, and regular Americans are paying the price. That's Trump's America in a nutshell. And instead of changing their policies and actually trying to help the American people, and not just themselves and their rich buddies, Trump and the Republicans are working to keep as many Americans from voting as humanly possible. That's what this bill is really about. And every senator who cares about our democracy should vote no. Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from the great state of Texas.
Mr. President, I came back to Washington, D.C. on Monday afternoon and decided I was going to leave some hamburgers, some Whataburger, famous hamburger from Texas, with some of the TSA agents who have not received a paycheck now for 2 pay periods. And we've seen the pictures during spring break and during all the activities in Austin. South by Southwest is going strong, and so there's a lot of stress on the men and women who are working in the Transportation Security Agency. And they're not being paid because of the Democrats' obstruction. In fact, they are objecting to the payment of not only TSA agents, but also the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Coast Guard, and as it turns out, one of the premier criminal investigation directorates in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as Homeland Security Investigations. This morning during the Worldwide Threats hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee, this was a public hearing, the FBI director confirmed that Homeland Security Investigations was a critical part of the interagency process to deal with the threat of homegrown terrorism. On March the 1st, we had a gunman go into 6th Street, a heavily populated area where people like to party, and proceeded to kill
3 innocent people and wound 12 others. He wore a sweatshirt that said "Property of Allah" and a T-shirt underneath that bore an Iranian flag. Of course, we're all familiar with the incidents that have occurred in New York, in Virginia, in Michigan, at the synagogue, and numerous other places, which will be repeated time and time again as long as Democrats decide not to pay the very people who we're depending on to investigate these cases and protect the American people. I know a lot of focus has been on TSA, and certainly they deserve to be paid and are doing heroic work. And by delivering some lunch to them, I thought, well, this at least will show some sort of appreciation. Unfortunately, I couldn't deliver them a paycheck. That's all I could do because of the obstruction on the Democratic side of the aisle. But this is something that I don't know whether the American people or even members of the Congress are fully aware of, that by blocking the Department of Homeland Security funding, the Homeland Security Investigations Directorate in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Department of DHS is not being paid, which is endangering the safety of the American people. Director Patel of the FBI confirmed that this morning. This has got to stop. It's hurting a lot of innocent people for no good cause. It's all based on political posturing, and innocent people are being hurt in the process. Mr. President, the Senate obviously is currently debating the Save America Act. I'm grateful to our colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, for introducing this legislation, and to Senator Thune for bringing up to the floor for debate and vote. And I want to recognize the contribution of my friend on the other well across the Capitol in the House of Representatives, Chip Roy, and others who championed this legislation all along. It does some very simple things that in a normal world would not be controversial. It says if you want to be an American citizen, if you want to vote, you got to be an American citizen. And if you want to cast a ballot, you have to have a photo ID, the same thing you need to get on an airplane or to buy cigarettes or a 6-pack of beer at a convenience store. Not particularly, shouldn't be controversial matters. But you know, you begin to wonder, okay, why would they oppose something that has such broad support among the electorate based on public opinion polling? Is that because the Democrats believe that illegal immigrants ought to be able to vote? And that a person ought to be able to cast a ballot without being able to confirm they are in fact the person who they claim to be? I think that's a very troubling matter, and I think it's Trump derangement syndrome myself. It's almost like anything and everything that President Trump proposes or does, Democrats reflexively oppose. The senator from Massachusetts was just here complaining about trying to take out the Iranian nuclear threat. Iran's the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. They've been enriching uranium in order to build a nuclear weapon. They've been building a stockpile of ballistic missiles and testing a space program that essentially will give them the technical knowledge they need to deliver intercontinental ballistic missiles, to ultimately manufacture those. And our colleagues on the other side of the aisle say this was not a threat to the United States. Well, in this same hearing we had this morning on global threats before the CIA, the DIA, the DNI, and all the alphabet soup of federal intelligence community components, they said this was a threat not only to us and our interests, but also to our allies in the region. And the idea that we would sit back and do nothing while Iran acquires a nuclear weapon is just sheer madness. again, what you have to ask yourself, why would our Democratic colleagues say, well, that's okay, we're not going to do anything, when the Iranian regime has had American blood on its hands and responsible for killing Americans over the years since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And can you imagine them getting access to a nuclear weapon, what that would do to the Middle East and world peace? And then acquiring the ballistic missile capability, be able to deliver that weapon thousands of kilometers away. Well, the very least thing that would happen is all the Gulf states would start to acquire nuclear weapons, and we'd have a nuclear arms race. And who knows what would be the outcome of that. So I don't know what it is about the way Democrats react to President Trump's proposals. It seems like they want to take the opposite view of President Trump no matter what it is. They wouldn't even stand up at the State of the Union when he said, stand up if you believe that we ought to enforce our laws and we ought to celebrate the people who keep our communities safe. And virtually all the Democrats sat on their hands because the last thing they would want to do is be found to agree with President Trump, even about something as obvious as that. So they picked the side of illegal immigration and non-enforcement of our immigration laws, which has proved to be an unmitigated disaster during the Biden administration, and we're now having to clean up for that mess. So it just is amazing to me that we find ourselves at this particular time in our nation's history where we are so polarized and where there is no willingness to try to work together in the best interest of the country. So here we are on a bill that would require only American citizens to vote and that you need a photo ID in order to cast your ballot. Well, our Democratic colleagues are, of course, doing what they usually do under these circumstances and saying this legislation will disenfranchise voters. Well, it will disenfranchise illegal aliens. It will disenfranchise non-citizens. That's the point. And they don't want to do that? Well, again, you have to wonder why. Is that because they want non-citizens, illegal immigrants, to be able to vote? Well, we know for every illegitimate vote cast that it undermines and dilutes the vote of those of us who are American citizens and who are entitled to cast a ballot. Well, I don't really get it. They're certainly appealing to a slice of the American electorate that I have a hard time understanding. But they ought to at least tell the truth. And the truth is, we are perfectly capable of making sure that this bill does not disenfranchise any American citizen, and that every American citizen who's entitled to vote can get a government-approved voter ID. We already do that in many of the red states like Texas. It's just some of the blue states where they lax voting integrity laws. And you have to, again, wonder why that is. And it doesn't lead you to a very pleasant or welcome conclusion. Well, we all know, as I said, that public opinion is on the side of this legislation. 71% of voters under a recent Harvard-Harris poll, including 50% of Democrats and 69% of independent voters, support the Save America Act. A 2025 poll from the Pew Research Center showed 83% of voters. You don't get consensus like that very often on any particular issue. But it included, that 83% included 71% of Democrats that supported requiring a photo identification when someone casts their ballot. These are apolitical polling organizations. They're not funded by Republican donors, and they don't have ties to any political operatives on the right. So the idea that Republicans are somehow trying to ram through a piece of partisan legislation, there's no evidence of that. It is false. It's untrue. The majority of Americans, including a majority of many Democrats and independents, support the Save America Act and its goals. If there are things that we need to do to tweak the bill to make it better, if our Democratic colleagues would help us in a way that they think would make sure we don't inadvertently disenfranchise anyone, we're more than happy to work with them. That's how legislation is supposed to be written. So it's shocking to me that none of our Democratic colleagues are willing to vote with Republicans on this common sense piece of legislation. Furthermore, talk about disenfranchisement of voters is simply insulting. It's blatantly untrue. Americans need a government-issued ID in order to drive a car, to buy a phone, to open a bank account, to buy a six-pack of beer, to get on an airplane, and the list goes on. I have never heard a complaint from any one of my almost 32 million constituents about their inability to drive because of the onerous burden of getting a driver's license, a photo ID. You can't rent a house without a government ID. The American people are smarter than I think Democrats give them credit for. Yet Democrats really think the American people won't be able to deal with this challenge of demonstrating that they are, in fact, legally qualified to vote and that they are who they say they are by producing a photo ID. Well, one objection we've heard from our colleagues is, well, it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, so why do we need a law requiring proof of citizenship? Well, if it weren't for the blue states that have lax voting laws, they don't check ahead of time to make sure somebody is actually legally qualified to vote. And once someone casts a ballot, it's almost impossible to figure out how to prosecute, identify and prosecute that individual. And the election's already over. Well, we look at the crime wave we see in many blue cities across the country after they defunded the police. That's another bright idea of our friends on the left. Resulted in thefts, carjacking, and murder. All of these activities were illegal, but because the law wasn't being enforced to deter these crimes, they happened. So just because something's illegal without enforcement, deterrence doesn't occur. And that's why we need a photo ID. It's also because with the dramatic increase of mail voting, voting by mail, that happened during the COVID pandemic, many Americans rightly became worried that this process of voting by mail could be abused. If a ballot is mailed to the wrong address, particularly if it's not solicited, if it's just mailed out en masse to various addresses, there's not much stopping the wrong person from filling it out, forging a signature, and dropping it in the mail. And without an enforcement mechanism like the Save America Act to prevent fraudulent voting, it makes no difference that it is technically already illegal. Founded on the principle. But the essence of the authority that we exercise here in Congress is as a result of the consent of the governed. That's where all authority comes from, the American people. And it is antithetical to the idea of consent of the governed that somebody who is not legally qualified to vote can cast a ballot, or somebody who wrongly claims to be another person can drop an unsolicited mail ballot into the mail and have that vote counted. It undermines the very basic foundation of what makes our country unique. Plus, people who are citizens and who are qualified to vote are entitled to know that their vote isn't going to be offset or diluted or undermined by somebody who's not legally qualified to vote. They deserve to know, we all deserve to know, that when we go to the polling place and cast a vote, that our vote is not being diluted by fraudulent voters who are voting early and often, or by somebody who's not qualified to vote by virtue of the fact that they're not a citizen. They're illegally in the country. Now, in my state and in many red states, I'm grateful that our state legislators had taken steps to address this problem. But in many blue states, that's not the case, and that's the reason we need a national law to deal with that, because of the blue states that are okay, apparently, with allowing non-citizens to vote, and they don't require any identification, so somebody can falsely claim to be somebody else and mail in an unsolicited mail-in ballot. So I'm grateful to our leadership in the state of Texas, Governor Abbott and the rest, to make sure that we have safe and secure elections through secure mail-in voting. And I'm proud we've taken this issue seriously and required voter ID. We started doing that more than a decade ago. But in many states, blue states, as I said, they've not done their due diligence to protect elections by preventing non-citizens or illegal aliens from voting. The American people deserve better than this. It's not enough to have safe and secure elections in places like Alaska and Texas. We need them in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Nor is it enough for it to be technically already illegal for non-citizens to vote, because, as I said, without enforcement, that's a meaningless requirement. The right of the American people to participate in the process of self-government must be effectively safeguarded in every state across the nation. In order for Congress to exercise the only legitimate authority there is in a democratic republic, which is based on consent of the governed. It's based on the fact we run for elections and we're elected by people who are qualified to vote to represent their views in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So, Mr. President, the solution's clear, and it's flabbergasting that this is even controversial, that our Democratic colleagues would be opposed. I've done everything in my power, including supporting the use of the talking filibuster and being open to other reforms to the legislative filibuster, as I discussed in a recent op-ed in the New York Post, in the hopes of passing this bill through the Senate and getting it to the President's desk. Mr. President, 70% of Americans support the Save America Act. Now the Senate must do whatever it takes for this monumental legislation, this common sense legislation, to become the law of the land. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Before I speak, the leadership asked me to make this unanimous request. I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I thank Senator Cornyn for his strong remarks in support of honest elections. I come to the floor for a different reason, but in support of what Senator Cornyn said, I want people to know that I have spoken on this issue already, and I'm not going to speak again, but I support and am a co-sponsor of Save America Act. In 8th grade civics and high school government classes, people studying the Congress and Article 1 of the Constitution probably go away from that study with the view that Congress only passes legislation and appropriates money. I wish they spent as much time on the constitutional responsibility of the Congress to be a check on the executive branch of government. I call that oversight. In schools, it's probably called other terms. I come to the floor today to emphasize this because this is the 21st anniversary of Sunshine Week. Sunshine Week continues to be a crucial reminder of the importance of open government and transparency. Sunshine Week emphasizes the checks and balances of government. 535 members of Congress have a responsibility of not only passing laws, but to see that the president faithfully executes those laws according to congressional intent. And when the president doesn't do that, to call a president out on that point of view. It's too bad we only use 1 week a year out of 52 to emphasize that. But Sunshine Week emphasizes something that's pretty simple. The public's business ought to be public. It also emphasizes another thing, that transparency and accountability are important checks on the federal government. It reminds bureaucrats that they ultimately work for and answer to we, the people. One transparency tool that I value is the Freedom of Information Act. That law requires government to proactively make materials public and also to respond to our requests and the public's request for information. After all, if it doesn't deal with national security and people's privacy, the public's business ought to be public. Last year, I held a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing highlighting how important this law is to government transparency. And congressional oversight is a part of my constitutional duty to protect taxpayers and to hold government accountable to the American people. And that also applies to 534 other members of Congress. A very important way to make this role of checks and balances work is listening to whistleblowers. Whistleblowers play a very critical role in this duty of congressional oversight. Whistleblowers are, for the most part, in the executive branch of government. They know what's being done according to law and money being spent appropriately. They see something wrong, they tell higher up in their agency about it. Sometimes that doesn't happen, or they don't get the actions that they think is appropriate to make sure the law is followed. So then these whistleblowers end up coming to those of us in Congress. Whistleblowers are patriots and our most powerful tool in rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, and of course misconduct, including the weaponization of our government. Too often, whistleblowers are treated like skunks at a picnic in the agencies they work in, when they ought to be commended for their bravery. It ought to be easier, not harder, for whistleblowers to report misconduct, particularly to the Congress. Whistleblowers must be protected from retaliation and fully informed of their rights under the laws we passed protecting whistleblowers. That's why this Congress, I've introduced legislation to extend the anti-gag provisions to cover federal employees of executive agencies, government corporations. This anti-gag provision requires government non-disclosure policies and similar agreements to inform employees that they can blow the whistle to Congress and to the agency's inspectors general. I've also introduced bipartisan legislation clarifying that duty speech whistleblowers have the same burdens of proof as other federal employees to prove retaliation. I've worked with the Trump administration to fix the wrongs of the Biden administration for whistleblowers across multiple federal agencies. I've urged Secretary Bassett to remedy the Biden-era retaliation against IRS whistleblowers Gary Shapley and Rosa Sigler. Thanks to the Trump administration, because this wouldn't happen without Trump being reelected, in March of 2025, these whistleblowers were promoted to leadership positions. Of course, let me emphasize, they shouldn't have been fired in the first place, and these are two examples of whistleblowers being treated like skunks at a picnic. I also worked with the Trump Department of Homeland Security to secure promotions for Customs Border Patrol whistleblowers Mark Jones, Mike Taylor, and Fred Wynn in May of 2025. These men face severe retaliation during the Biden administration. In August of last year, I assisted 10 FBI whistleblowers with their compensation agreements with the FBI. These whistleblowers were subject to demotions, security clearances. Those were suspended, and other retaliations for reporting misconduct at the Biden Department of Justice and Federal Bureau of Investigation. Earlier this year, I worked with the Trump administration to secure an alcohol, tobacco, firearm whistleblower, new employment, and a financial agreement. He, like others, was severely retaliated against by the Biden Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Agency. Thanks to whistleblowers, we know that partisan FBI agents and Department of Justice prosecutors created and advanced the partisan investigation known as Arctic Frost. Arctic Frost was a vehicle to improperly investigate the entire Republican political apparatus. Subpoenas went out for about 400 conservative and Republican organizations and individuals. Jack Smith and the FBI secretly obtained tolling data from Republican members of the Congress. Jack Smith and his team issued at least 197 subpoenas targeting these 400 individuals and entities. Jack Smith, by the way, all of these entities and individuals were Republican. Jack Smith set out almost the day after Trump announced he was going to seek re-election to put President Trump in prison. And that all went on during the Biden administration. Now I've launched a new Arctic Frost website outlining my investigations and the thousands of pages of records that I've made public. And I'd like to note to everybody, a majority of these records were made public through me from whistleblowers, not the government agency itself, which once again emphasize if you want the public's business to be public, if you want transparency to bring accountability, you see the very famous or very important role that whistleblowers play in government accountability. In November last year, I also made public records showing the partisan officials at the Department of Justice and FBI interfered with investigations, also alleged wrongdoing by the Clinton campaign. Despite records showing that FBI agents had evidence the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee intentionally concealed payments that targeted then candidate Trump, meaning during his first campaign, Department of Justice officials Richard Pilger and J.B. Cooney declined to investigate. Pilger and Cooney were also at the center of greenlighting Arctic Frost and Jack Smith's elector case against President Trump. Now, it happens that political infection isn't just a Department of Justice and FBI problem. In November 2024, I wrote to FEMA after reports alleged agency workers instructed a team responding to hurricane survivors to avoid homes with yard signs showing support for President Trump. Reportedly, at least 20 homes in Florida weren't given opportunities for FEMA assistance. In response to my oversight requests, the Trump FEMA told my office it fired 3 employees who engaged in this type of misconduct for political purposes, which was presumably to hurt President Trump's election efforts. Through my oversight, I've also exposed flaws in the Health and Human Services program called the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I've also pressed the State Department on then Secretary Kerry's obstruction of arrests of Iranian terrorists, and third, sought to obtain information from multiple agencies on Afghan evacuees responsible for the horrific shooting of 2 service members from the West Virginia National Guard. Now, the federal government isn't the only bad actor who whistleblowers provided sunlight on. Last Congress, the Simon Wiesenthal Center disclosed to my office that Credit Suisse obstructed an internal investigation of the bank's Nazi-linked accounts. In February 2026, I held a bipartisan Senate Judiciary Committee on this very matter. It revealed that Credit Suisse maintained at least 890 accounts linked to Nazi officials. My hearing also revealed UBS, that's a bank, who has since acquired Credit Suisse, has begun similar obstructive conduct. So here we get to the end of my remarks. As my examples show, whistleblowers are key to transparency. Sunshine Week that we're celebrating this week is an opportunity for the country to highlight the righteous fight for transparency in government. Again, repeating, the public's business ought to be public. Transparency of everything that goes on in government brings accountability. Sunshine is essential to making government accountable to we, the people. I yield.
Chuck, is it okay if I talk now? Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today in strong support of a bill that I have supported from the very beginning, that being the SAVE Act. The Save America Act is common sense. At its core, this legislation is about something very simple, protecting the integrity of our elections. All this bill does is it ensures that U.S. citizens vote in U.S. elections, and that when you show up to vote, you have to prove who you are. That's not too much to ask of someone who's showing up to vote. It's common sense. Now, while it is simple, it is also essential. The right to vote is the foundation of our republic. Trusted, secure elections are what have made us the greatest nation in the world and a beacon of freedom for nearly 250 years. We cannot take this for granted. Across the country, we've seen radical groups weaken election integrity and chip away at Americans' confidence in elections. In some places, voter rolls have been padded with non-citizens, and basic verification methods have become an afterthought, undermining the constitutional rights of the rest of us who are American citizens. The Save America Act puts a stop to this by requiring proof of citizenship when registering to vote, something many states, including my state of Idaho, already enforce. Idaho already has some of the most secure elections in the nation. The Save America Act simply holds the rest of the country to the same standard we follow in the GEM state, thus ensuring that all of us in America are held to the same standard and to an election that is a believable election and has confidence of America. Now, there's been a great deal of misinformation regarding the SAVE Act. So let me state clearly what this act does and does not do. First, the Save America Act does not federalize our elections. It keeps them squarely in the hands of the states, as it should be. Second, some of my Democrat colleagues claim this legislation is voter suppression. That is simply false. The requirements to vote in our elections are clear. You must be a U.S. citizen, at least 18 years old, and a resident of the state where you are registered. That's not too much to ask. It certainly doesn't suppress votes. The Save America Act does not change those requirements or add unnecessary red tape. What it does is ensure that the most fundamental requirement, U.S. citizenship, is actually verified when someone registers to vote. Under current law, individuals can register to vote in federal elections by simply checking a box claiming they are a citizen. The Save America Act closes that loophole by requiring proof of U.S. citizenship at the beginning of the voter registration process. It only needs to be done once. That is not voter suppression. It is basic election integrity. Third, Democrats are arguing that requiring identification makes voting harder. But Americans already show identification for countless activities in routine daily life. We needed to drive a car. We needed to board an airplane. We needed to go to work for a job, and so much more. If we expect ID for these basic actions, it's only reasonable to expect that proof of citizenship before someone is allowed to participate in federal elections. Poll after poll shows that the vast majority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats and independents, support requiring identification and proof of citizenship to vote. So let's do our job and vote for what the American people want. Every American should have confidence that when they cast a ballot, their vote counts and is not diluted by non-citizens voting in the same election. The Save America Act ensures that that's what happens. Safeguarding our elections is not only common sense, it is integral for a country like the United States of America that is a robust democracy have in order for people to have confidence in the country. That's why I'm committed to doing what it takes to pass the Save America Act. I'm proud to support this bill and work with my Republican colleagues to get it to the President Trump's desk to be signed into law. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think all of us know here in the Senate that senators have the ability to write the titles of their own bills. You can give a bill whatever name you want, whether it's accurate and true or misleading. And in this case, we have a bill that's been entitled the Save America Act. But make no mistake, this is not about saving America. That is a fraud on the American people. And what we are hearing from our Republican colleagues and what we hear from the President of the United States is that there's this rampant non-citizen voting in our election. Donald Trump says there's so many non-citizens voting at the polls that they're rigged. In fact, that's why he lost in 2020, he says. But of course, we know there's zero proof for that. We know, in fact, that it's a big lie. It's already illegal to vote if you're not a United States citizen. And the cases of non-citizen registration and non-citizen voting are vanishingly rare, almost non-existent. So what is this really about? Well, it is about Trump's obsession with a federal takeover of our elections. That's not my word, that's his. He said he wanted to take over our elections. And Donald Trump does want to make it particularly hard for voters who they think will vote against them, wants to make it particularly hard for those voters to actually be able to cast their votes. And that's what this bill is all about. It is about making it more difficult for millions and millions of Americans to exercise their right to vote, and calculated to try to make it harder for those Americans who President Trump assesses will vote against him or against Republicans. Why else would Donald Trump have said, quote, "It will guarantee the midterms"? By it, he meant this bill. So the President of the United States is saying that if Republicans pass this bill, it will guarantee them the midterm elections. The only way that could be true is if this bill were designed to try to prevent, slow down, make it harder for millions of Americans to cast their vote who Republicans and Donald Trump think will vote against Republicans in the midterms. He goes on to say, quote, "If you don't get it, big trouble," meaning that if we actually let American citizens vote and we don't put up these additional restrictions, President Trump assesses that Republicans will lose the midterms, and he's desperate to change that. We already saw that in the redistricting effort in Texas and other places around the country. This is part and parcel of that effort. Donald Trump said that was the goal, and in fact, recently fired former Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem said the same thing in different words. Here's what she said a few weeks ago in Arizona. Said, quote, "We've been proactive to make sure that we have the right people to vote." And then she said the other part out loud, to vote to elect the right leaders. In other words, let's try to shape the electorate by passing this bill so that we the Republicans and President Trump get the voters they want to elect the, quote, leaders they want, meaning Republicans. That's what this is all about. It's not about saving America. It's about saving Republicans in the midterm elections and beyond. And they do this by making it harder for citizens to vote. So yes, it is suppressing the vote. If you make it harder for anyone in this room who's an American citizen or anybody around the country to go out and cast their vote, if you put up hurdles to casting those votes, yes, it's making it more difficult to vote. That is suppressing the vote. So let's look a little more deeply at the underlying claims behind this bill, right? The claim that we have all these non-citizens that are voting. They can't prove it. In fact, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said that non-citizens voting is something they know is happening, quote, intuitively. Intuitively. He went on to say, but it's not something that's easily provable. Not something easily provable. That's ridiculous. Of course it's provable. People go into a voting booth, they give their name, that's a matter of the official record, and you can go about finding out whether the person who registered and cast their vote, in fact, is an American citizen. It is provable. And the problem Republicans have is they set out to prove it and came out completely empty. Completely empty. Let's look at the findings of the Conservative Heritage Foundation. So this is a conservative think tank, Republican think tank. They could only find 24 instances in 20 years of somebody who voted without being a citizen, or maybe it was just registered to vote, but 24 instances between the year 2003 and the year 2023. This is what they're calling a rampant problem. The Cato Institute, it's not a liberal organization, it put out a report last month noting that Utah, the state of Utah, reviewed its approximately 2.1 million voters and found one confirmed non-citizen who had registered but never voted. I mean, it's certainly possible that if you're a permanent resident, if you have a green card, you might mistakenly believe you can vote in an election and register and then realize you really can't, and then not cast the vote. So Utah looked at 2.1 million voters, not a single one, not a single non-citizen among them cast a vote, and only one registered. In Georgia, out of 8.2 million registrants, Georgia found only 20 who were non-citizens. I don't even know if they ended up voting or not. So obviously in this country, we want only American citizens to vote, and that is what's happening. American citizens are the ones who are voting, not non-citizens. And if you think about that, it makes intuitive sense, right? The penalty, the federal penalty for providing false information when you register is up to 5 years in prison. And then if you actually go ahead and cast a vote as a non-citizen, it's up to another 1 year in prison. Nobody is going to risk going to prison for 6 years in order to cast a vote in an election. I mean, that defies common sense, and it also defies the fact, which is why Republicans can't come up with any proof to support their claim, which they argue justifies this bill. None. Again, the Speaker says it's an intuition. In other words, it's a feeling he's got. But there's no proof to support it, because there isn't any. So that is the false claim being made to justify this bill. In other words, it's a bill in search of a problem, but actually the problem doesn't exist, so it's obviously in search of something else. And that something else is making it harder for millions of Americans to vote. As I mentioned, Donald Trump thinks if this bill is passed, it will, quote, guarantee Republicans the midterm. Former Secretary of Homeland Security says we need this bill to get the right voters to vote for the, quote, right leaders. I was just listening to one of my Republican colleagues on the floor talk about how we need ID for all sorts of things, and of course that's true. You need a license to drive a car. But guess what? That license that you get, that's not proof of citizenship. That doesn't qualify under this bill. Even the new real IDs don't qualify for proof of citizenship under this bill, because there are non-citizens who have those forms of ID. So when Republican senators talk about how these other forms of ID that we use every day, suggesting that they could be used for this purpose, that's just not true. What this bill does is essentially narrow the forms of ID that you need to prove that you're a citizen in the first place to essentially two categories. One is a passport. Now, it turns out that only about half of Americans have a passport. So that means half of the American citizens that are preparing to go out and vote will not be able to vote because they wouldn't have the proof of citizenship. They don't have the passport. Or it's an original birth certificate. Well, I think we all know that there are lots of Americans that don't have their original birth certificate. In fact, if you're a woman who's gotten married and changed her name, that original birth certificate won't provide you the proof of citizenship required under this law. And research at the Brennan Center at the University of Maryland shows that more than 21 million American citizens do not have these required documents readily available. 21 million American citizens. who will be forced to go through all these additional hoops and, by the way, pay money in order to get the required ID. And of course, in America, we're not supposed to have a poll tax. You're not supposed to have to pay the government any money for the right to exercise your right to vote. But that's what this bill does for maybe up to 21 million of our fellow American citizens. So if there really were like proof of an epidemic of non-citizen voting, of course we would need to look for ways to prevent that from happening. We would have to come up with some form of required ID to meet that problem. But there is no proof there. There is no there. Now, one of the ways that the Trump administration proposed trying to get to the bottom of all this claim fraud was to require states to send the Department of Homeland Security their voting information. In fact, the Department of Justice has been asking a lot of states for this information. You may recall that Attorney General Bondi and former Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem were telling people in Minnesota, you know, we'll call back ICE and their lawless efforts if you give us your voter ID information. And of course, in our country, we have state-based elections. Thank goodness. Thank goodness we count our elections at the state level. Can you imagine if we did what Donald Trump wants to do, which is federalize the elections and like count them at the White House? I mean, you remember in 2020, after he lost, the President of the United States was calling down to Georgia, Fulton County, and saying, find me, what was it, 6,000 some votes? Thank goodness we don't have centralized federal elections in the United States of America, because you can be sure that President Trump would make sure when he conducted the count at the White House, it would come out his way. So we don't have that, but we now have a Department of Homeland Security who is essentially demanding that states provide the federal government with their voter information. And a lot of states are suing, they're fighting back. Some states have been providing that information to the Department of Justice and to other entities. But it turns out that when the states hear back from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security is giving them all sorts of misinformation. Let's look at a couple examples of states that have already shared their voter roll data with DHS. And this was, again, for the purpose of DHS checking to make sure that voter rolls in those states did not include non-citizens. So DHS was going to scrub those records and let the states know what kind of problems they have. Well, Missouri's records were reviewed by DHS, and turns out DHS found hundreds of voters that DHS said were ineligible to vote. Guess what? It turned out that DHS was wrong. They were eligible voters. So DHS was essentially telling the state of Missouri that eligible American citizen voters, in fact, were not eligible. As one county clerk in Missouri said of the DHS system, quote, "This is not ready for prime time, and I'm not going to risk the security and constitutional rights of my voters for a bad idea," unquote. That's a clerk in the state of Missouri. An election administrator in Texas said, and I quote, "I really find no merit in any of this," unquote. That was after 3 eligible Texas voters, in other words, eligible American citizen Texas voters, had been flagged for removal by DHS So here's the state of Texas. Okay, DHS, take a look at our voter files, and you find all those people that are really not American citizens. Well, guess what? They didn't get any back that flagged people who were not American citizens. They did get back people that DHS claimed were not eligible, but when Texas inspected it, turns out they were eligible to vote. That's the kind of operation that the Trump administration is running at DHS. Now, in addition to requiring this essential federal takeover of review of the voter rolls, this second bill that's been introduced by Republicans in the Senate is even worse than the first, right? The first was called the SAVE Act. This one's called the Save America Act, which, as I said, the real purpose is to save the Republican Party in the midterm elections act. But this second one actually makes it harder for people to register to vote and to vote. So it includes new provisions that President Trump has demanded, prohibiting vote by mail except in very, very narrow circumstances. In order to vote by mail, a voter would have to submit sworn certifications of the specific circumstances, including their health status or travel plans, to their Board of Elections. And even after that, you can't just drop the ballot in the mailbox. You have to send it by certified mail with signature verification. So this isn't a voter ID bill. That's just untrue. It's a specific kind of ID that's required, which millions of American citizens don't have. It's really a show me your papers voter purge bill, making it harder for American citizens to exercise their right to vote. And so, as I said earlier, the real purpose is not to prevent non-citizens from voting, it's to prevent citizens who the Trump administration and Republicans assess will vote against them in the midterm elections, to make it harder for them to vote. You're seeing many other efforts that are ongoing right now to try to rig the midterm elections. I mentioned earlier the efforts to redistrict in Texas. We see challenges to the Voting Rights Act. We see this bill. It's a sign of desperation. It's a sign that Donald Trump knows that the American people don't like what they see coming out of this administration. After all, this is a president who, as a candidate, said he would keep us out of wars, especially in the Middle East, and he would focus on lowering prices. That's what candidate Trump said. What has President Trump delivered? He's gotten us involved in more conflicts than any other president in a very long time, including an illegal war of choice in Iran as we speak. And prices and costs are going up, up, up. Price of groceries going up, price of rent and mortgages going up, health care going up. By the way, we could have at least reduced some people's health care costs if this Senate had voted to extend the Affordable Care Act tax credits, but Republicans in this body blocked that effort. And so I have constituents in Maryland that now have to pay more because while the Republican so-called big beautiful bill permanently extended tax cuts for billionaires, they let the one tax credit that helps middle-class families afford their health insurance, they let that one lapse. Billionaires, permanent tax cuts, American working families, tax credit for health care, that one they let die, go away. And so health care costs are going up really for everybody. Child care costs are going up. And instead of addressing those issues, we have a president who continues to hide portions of the Epstein files from the survivors as well as from the American people. We have a president who is engaged in driving up the costs to the American people instead of bringing them down. I don't know exactly how many days it's been since the Supreme Court struck down his illegal tariff tax. But it's certainly been enough time for the president and his administration to say that they're going to send the money they stole from the American people back to American households. $1,700 per household is the estimate of what it costs on average, what those Trump illegal tariff taxes cost on average. Give them their money back, President Trump. Do it today. But that's not what President Trump's doing. The war in Iran has already cost us the lives of 13 service members, hundreds more injured, over 2,000 civilians killed throughout the region, from Iran to Lebanon to Israel, including over 160 Iranian schoolgirls, killed apparently by a U.S. Tomahawk missile. And that war is making us less safe, not more safe. We all know that the administration has no end game. They took the lid off Pandora's box. They, together with Israel, took out a number of members of the Iranian regime. It's a heinous regime and has been brutal to its own people. But public reporting indicates that our intelligence agencies assess that if you got rid of the top-level Iranian leadership, very likely they'd be replaced by even more radical leaders, people who are closer to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. In other words, people who are even more dangerous and more likely to destabilize the region. And that's what we're seeing. We're spending $1 billion of taxpayer money every day, probably more, on this war that's making us less safe. And by the way, for the president who said he was going to reduce prices, oil and gas prices are going up, up, up. So the American people don't like what they see. And on top of this, it's mixed with a toxic amount of corruption, right? We've got the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, going around and pretending to be the big peacemaker in the Middle East. Look how that's going. And at the same time doing big, huge deals with Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia and others. We know that this is a president who, with his so-called meme coin, has pocketed millions and millions of dollars for himself and his family. Accepted a luxury jet from the Qatari royal family. Gold-plated Rolex desk clock from Swiss business leaders. In exchange for a gold crown, gave South Korea a lower tariff rate. And probably one of the most corrupt transactions of them all was with the UAE. Because what happened with the UAE was just before Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, someone in the UAE, one of the members of the royal family, made a huge investment in the Trump family stablecoin business. A huge investment. And it wasn't long thereafter that the president's son, Eric Trump, went to the UAE. And guess what happened? Sheikh Thanoon, who's a member of the royal family, invested billions of dollars in that Trump family stablecoin business. And then it was about 2 weeks later that Donald Trump goes to the UAE and says to the UAE he's going to relax the restrictions the United States had in place on the transfer of very sophisticated technology to the UAE. Semiconductor technology, AI technology, and we were especially worried about transferring that technology to a particular set of companies in the UAE because of their relationships with China. But you know what? The UAE, member of the royal family, had just invested a lot of money in the Trump family stablecoin business, and so, hey, Donald Trump relaxed the restrictions on the transfer of U.S. technology to the UAE and put that at risk of transfer to China. Massive corruption to benefit the Trump family at the expense of American national security. So, yeah, the American people don't like what they're seeing. We are seeing that in all the polling. And so what this bill before us is the last-ditch effort by the President of the United States and Republicans in the Senate and the House to try to save themselves in the midterm elections. Not by winning fair and square, not by saying every American citizen should be able to exercise their right to vote, but by making it harder for those American citizens that they think are likely to vote against them and for Democrats, making it harder for those people to vote. It's not the Save America Act, it's the Save the Republican Party, the Midterm Elections Act. You know, you would think that President Trump would recognize that where the American people really want to see action is on meeting the promises that he made. Like, keep us out of foreign wars, including this illegal war of choice in Iran. Actually do something to bring down prices. I've tried to get the White House interested in a bill I've introduced. It's called Power for the People Act. It's got a very simple premise, which is that consumers across America, ratepayers, our constituents, they shouldn't have to be paying higher electricity costs to fund data centers being built by the richest companies and corporations on the planet. In my state of Maryland, we're part of a 13-state grid called PJM. People living in those areas have spent $28 billion in higher electricity costs already for those data centers. So we really need to focus on what candidate Trump said he wanted to focus on, bringing down costs and ending foreign wars, not doing the opposite. And this bill is an attempt by Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress to prevent the American people from expressing their views at the ballot box in November 2026 by making it harder for millions of Americans to vote. That's what this is really about. And I urge my colleagues to strongly oppose it. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President. The Senator from New Mexico.
I would ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nearly 5 years ago, I stood on the Senate floor and I said that we were facing the most dangerous and overt threat to our democratic system in generations. I was speaking then in support of the John Lewis for the People Act. Along with my Democratic colleagues, I was pushing to expand Americans' right to vote and push back against the influence of dark money in our elections. But the threat facing us then pales in comparison to the one that we face today in the form of the Republicans' so-called SAVE Act. Because their SAVE Act does nothing to save anyone from anything. It does not protect our freedoms, it does not protect our elections, and it does not protect our country. Instead, it actively targets all three. So I rise again today to face down this new, dangerous, and overt threat, this time coming from within our own federal government. I rise again today in defense of our right to vote, because our right to vote is the foundation of every other right that we have. From our right to bear arms to our right to peacefully protest, it is only through our right to vote that we can protect those freedoms and demand a government that does the same. We know this to our core, to our founding, to the genesis of our country. When 250 years ago we fought for independence from kings, we did so for a government of the people, by the people. The future of that government right now depends on protecting Americans' right to vote. It depends on ensuring that this lever to hold our leaders accountable, to steer our country's future, and to deliver on our country's promise remains in the hands of Americans. That is in the hands of all Americans. And when I think about the importance of this fight, I think about my former colleague, whose office was right across the hall from mine when I was a member of the House of Representatives. I think about Congressman John Lewis. I think about him and the thousands who marched in Selma and put their lives on the line to call for the passage of the Voting Act of 1965. I think about the thousands who fought against reading tests and poll taxes, folks who faced lynching for having the audacity to cast their vote, folks who ensured access to the vote wouldn't belong only to the wealthy, land-owning men. I think about the thousands of women who organized and marched to demand passage of the 19th Amendment. The women who led that movement and the women who rightly demanded to be included within it. And I think about the legislative and courtroom battles that delivered the right to vote to Native Americans and Mexican Americans, a right so fundamental to our democracy, but one that generations upon generations of Americans had to fight for, continuing into today. It is our right to make our voices heard through our vote, regardless of income or education, regardless of race or gender. When we as Americans exercise our right to vote, we hold in our hands the reins of this great democracy. And while I stand here in reverence of that incredible right and the decades and decades of work that have brought it into the reach of millions, I also stand here in defense of it, because it is truly under direct threat right now. Republicans' SAVE Act would strip the right to vote from those who don't already have a passport or a birth certificate or the time and money to expedite getting one. It would strip the right to vote from women who took their husband's last name and don't have the means to get the affidavits or extra documents to prove that they are the same person they were at birth. And it would effectively strip voters of the ability to register to vote by mail. And the substitute amendment that was offered yesterday would eliminate most mail-in voting altogether. This SAVE Act is today's poll tax, today's exclusion of everyday Americans. Senate Republicans claim that this is necessary to confront the threat of foreign citizens voting in our elections. But the requirements of their SAVE Act the requirements that their act imposes are neither necessary nor justified. They are by design. They are intended to reimpose a wealth requirement to vote, and they are intended to attack married women's right to vote. These are real threats that this legislation poses. This is not a voter ID bill. This is a voter suppression bill. And while the consequences will fall heaviest on married women and those without the money and time to get the necessary documents, it's up to all Americans to push back. Which reminds me of the words of Benjamin Franklin. When asked at the Constitutional Convention if our founders had created a monarchy or a republic, Franklin famously said, "A republic, if you can keep it." We can, we must, and we know how. Because generations upon generations have fought for our sacred right to vote, and in that fight they have shown us the way. Because these are not the first threats we've faced to elections in our country's history, or even in my limited time in the Congress. In 2016, we saw Russia execute a concerted campaign to mislead and divide Americans, all in an effort to influence that year's presidential election. As a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I helped investigate those efforts, recommending reforms to push back and supporting funding to improve election security across the country, including in my home state of New Mexico. In 2021, we saw then defeated President Trump push his big lie and urge insurrectionists to storm the Capitol to stop the 2020 presidential election certification. As a member of this body, I joined my colleagues in ensuring that the election certification would continue, and later in clarifying our laws to fortify our election certification process going forward. And last July, I helped introduce the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to fully restore that landmark legislation and to override the Supreme Court's 2013 decision that took an axe to the heart of it. But now, as we enter this midterm election, we see the threats for what they are and who they are coming from. They aren't coming from foreign governments or defeated candidates this time. They're coming from within our own federal government and directly targeting American citizens' right to vote. They are coming from our commander-in-chief, and they are coming from our Department of Justice, and they are coming from many in the Republican Party. They're coming from folks who would rather sabotage and strip away Americans' right to vote than face the American people's dissatisfaction, or for that matter, be willing to tackle affordability. And the legislation they're using to do that is their so-called SAVE Act, one of the most extreme voter suppression bills in recent history. It is intended to undermine our elections using tactics that are straight out of an authoritarian playbook. But we know how to defeat this new threat. Vote no. Vote no on the SAVE Act because it would require every American to prove their citizenship with a passport or a document like a birth certificate every time they register or re-register to vote. Because about 140 million Americans don't have passports. And about 21 million Americans don't have ready access to documents proving their citizenship either. But the process to get a passport, that's not fast. That's not easy. In fact, that's not inexpensive. Requiring voters to purchase or renew a passport for $130 is a modern-day poll tax. This is Jim Crow 2.0. That's even assuming you can get yours in time to actually be able to use it to vote in this year's election. And while I support verifying citizenship, that process should not be limited to just passports and birth certificates. We already have ways to do this, like the motor voter program, which the SAVE Act would effectively eliminate. That program verifies citizenship. Vote no on the SAVE Act because it would require people whose names don't match their birth certificates, like women who have taken their husband's last name, to provide notarized affidavits, documentation that will undoubtedly take more time and more money to produce. Vote no on the SAVE Act because it affects our veterans, too. With the SAVE Act, many service members and veterans won't be able to register to vote or to vote with their military IDs, even people who fought for this country. Vote no on the SAVE Act because even if you happen to have the right documents, you'll find that the bill all but eliminates voter registration drives, online registration, and automatic registration. Vote no on the SAVE Act because even when it's done eviscerating your rights to vote, the SAVE Act would turn its sights on election officials. It would require massive unfunded changes on how elections are administered on the ground overnight. Changes that local governments would be forced to pay for, all while exposing election officials to criminal and civil liability. If you're tempted to vote yes, let me ask this. What does it say about leaders whose sole strategy for remaining in power requires depriving American citizens of the right to vote? It shows they're weak, it shows they're scared. It shows that their allegiance is to power, not to the American people. And it shows that they have no intention of. Deborah from Las Cruces says, especially in New Mexico, so many citizens do not have the resources to get the sort of documentation that this act requires. It will target not only those in need, but also women who have recently married and changed their name, people who have moved to a different home, Native Americans with little access to the bureaucracy to even obtain documents, and older people who may have been born at home and never had a birth certificate to begin with. Don from Rio Rancho writes, it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement, streamline, and add staff because we would all have to go in person. And if you live in a rural community, the whole process is even harder. Mariah from Santa Fe writes, this is a brazen attempt to strip the voting rights of trans, immigrant, and women voters across the country and the GOP's way of putting their thumb on the scale of Americans' future. All of us deserve a part in the great experiment of American democracy. So much progress is made when we're all included, not excluded. And Ms. Marsh Davis from Bloomfield says, this legislation is not about election security. It's a coordinated effort to suppress lawful voters by turning registration into a bureaucratic obstacle course. Voting should not hinge on flawless paperwork. When officials are afraid to register voters, democracy suffers. Voter suppression is not always loud. Often it works through inconvenience, confusion, and quiet disqualification, ensuring voters only discover the problem when it's too late. These are the voices of my constituents from New Mexico, and they are not alone. Because right now, most Americans know that the SAVE Act is not the answer. They see through Republicans' voter suppression scheme, and they are asking us here in the Senate to fight back. So let me close with some words from United States Senator Dennis Chavez of my great state. Either we are all free or we fail. Democracy must belong to all of us. Mr. President, I have a passport. I have the same last name today as I did when I was born. The SAVE Act won't stop me from voting, but it will stop thousands upon thousands of my constituents. I'll repeat, this is not a voter ID bill. This is a voter suppression bill. All American citizens should have the same right to vote as the senators in this room. All American citizens deserve to hold the reins of this great democracy in their hands. So for those constituents, for all Americans, I say again, either we are all free or we fail. Democracy must belong to all of us. I call upon my colleagues in the Senate, choose freedom, choose democracy, and say no to this so-called SAVE Act.
The senator from Maryland.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk should call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President, I ask
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, in a moment, my good friend, my colleague from Georgia, will offer a resolution that is very simple. It says, fund TSA, period. No ands, ifs, or buts, no excuses, no secondary reasons. If senators want to fund TSA, they should simply support the resolution of Senator Warnock. No ands, ifs, or buts. Who is blocking TSA money from being approved? Republicans. On several occasions, Democrats have gone to the floor and said, let's just fund TSA. We know that there are discussions about ICE and Border Patrol that we haven't resolved, but why hold TSA hostage? Why hold passengers at our airports who are waiting on long lines hostage? All the Republicans have to do is say yes, and those lines will be greatly reduced or go away. The waiting will be greatly reduced, and people will be much happier. So to hold our airport travelers and our TSA workers as hostage is so much the wrong thing to do, and the American people don't like it. But the American people should know, if they get up and block the Warnock resolution, it is Republicans blocking funding for TSA, creating those long lines, and standing in the way of funding our hardworking TSA workers. Democrats are giving Republicans another chance. We can fund TSA workers today. We can make sure our airports are secure today. We can make sure the workers are paid today. They just need to get out of the way and stop blocking TSA officers' paychecks. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Georgia.
so grateful for the leadership of Senator Schumer, and he speaks for all of us. the thing that we have in common on both sides of the aisle is that my colleagues and I travel back and forth from this city to our home states every week. Airplanes are our other office. So every week I fly here or fly back home, I pass by hardworking agents of the TSA. I get to see their dedication up close, their professionalism. They are public service in action. They are working long hours around the clock every day of the year. Wherever we're trying to go, our TSA agents get us there safely, safely to work, safely back to our families, wherever the public is trying to go. And these public servants sacrifice their holidays, their special moments with their families so that we can get to our families. They work nights and weekends to make sure that we in this chamber and the millions of Americans that travel through our nation's airports can do that without fear. And so this is basic. No one should be fooling around with the TSA agents. We have our differences, our debates in this chamber. But for the second time in a year, our TSA workers are working without pay because of Washington dysfunction. Here's what I believe. I believe that if you are working, particularly during a government shutdown, then you should be fully paid. I believe this so much that I've broken with members of my own party to vote to pay all federal workers, which includes TSA officers, during government shutdowns. I think it's simply wrong for my Republican colleagues to use these hardworking Americans as leverage, as pawns, in what they are presenting as a false choice to the American people. Here's the choice that they're presenting to us. They're saying to us, either shut down the government, denying working people the money that they have earned, or vote to continue to support the president's paramilitary force that is wreaking havoc in our streets and killing ordinary citizens for exercising their First Amendment rights. That's a false choice, one I simply cannot accept, and it confounds common sense. The time is always right, Dr. King used to say, to do what's right. And so I'm calling on this chamber to pay TSA workers right now before we again all head to the airports. Let's keep having this debate, but pay the TSA workers. And so with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S4127, the TSA Pay Act, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Sir. The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, thank you. I do thank my colleague for coming to the floor to be able to talk about this today. He and I are both on airplanes a lot. The comment that has been made here on the floor, though, is before we leave here this week, this should be resolved. I could not agree more on that principle. In fact, last Thursday, I came and said, we should not leave at all this weekend. We should commit to stay. In fact, Senator Hassan and I, my Democratic colleague from New Hampshire, she and I have a bill that says when we get to a moment like this and we have an impasse, we stay. We don't leave. I brought that to the floor last Thursday, Mr. President, and said, let's stay. And everybody left. Went right past TSA officials who are not being paid and went wherever people went over the weekend. I'm saying the same thing again. We should stay here and work out our differences. The easiest way to actually resolve this long term is to say when we get to an impasse on funding, those workers are still paid. There's an automatic continuing resolution that kicks in to make sure they're paid, but we stay in session 7 days a week until we resolve the issues. We shouldn't have weekends when there's a problem somewhere in funding around the country. The pressure should be on us to be able to get things resolved, to debate it out. We are the grown-ups that are supposed to be talking about all these things and working out all of our differences. But that's not happening. And that's been frustrating. Last Thursday, I brought up that the White House had sent over a counter-proposal. There was a proposal that was sent over at the very beginning of this close down of DHS that the White House said, here's some ideas that we want to have. The Democrats then said, no, we want this instead, sent it back over to the White House. The White House then said, okay, we'll take some of your ideas and we'll send this back to you. And then they waited 18 days for Senate Democrats to respond to the White House. 18 days. The White House just had to wait for a counteroffer. As my Senate colleagues were just saying, we're thinking about it. Well, that response did finally come on Monday, but it was a response back to the White House of the same thing they had sent before. The White House is trying to get this resolved, not just for TSA, but how about for Coast Guard? Now, my Democratic colleagues came and said, well, okay, we'll fund Coast Guard as well, in TSA, in Secret Service. But do you know who's not been funded? There's been no offer to fund customs officials that actually work at all of our ports of entry. Their pay is going to be blocked. Homeland Security individuals, there's been no offer to be able to pay those folks around at all. The Homeland Security investigators that actually handle child trafficking, human smuggling, all of our investigations along the border dealing with drug smuggling, there's been no offer to fund them at all. We've simply said this is silly to try to break this up into different aspects of who's going to get funding and who's not going to get funding. TSA is going to get funding, but the customs officials aren't going to get funding. Coast Guard's going to get funding, but the people investigating human smuggling, they're not going to get funding. Let's sit down and figure this out. Let's not have 18 days between an offer and a counteroffer. Let's actually figure this out. Senator Warnock and I could probably sit down this afternoon and solve this. All that everyone's looking for is, how do we actually get people in the room willing to make the decision and making the decisions on this so we can get this all worked out and done? And interestingly enough, Mr. President, I was incredibly humbled because when I walked through TSA this week, I walked through with grief as I walked through. Because all I can think is, these folks are busting it. When I get there early in the morning, they've been there for hours already, and they're not getting paid. The folks in Oklahoma are still showing up. We're not seeing the long lines and sick calls and all that kind of stuff. That's not happening in my state. People are still showing up. And I walk past them embarrassed, saying, I'm so sorry that we've not been able to get everybody together to be able to get this solved. But when I came through this week, as I walked through, the first TSA agent that I encountered said to me, we have something for you. And the second person as I came through the line said, don't walk away, we have something for you. And then when I got to my gate, the head of the TSA group in my city walked out and handed me their challenge coin from my local TSA group. And he handed it to me and he said, we see what you're doing. You are trying to get us paid. You're trying to get everybody paid. And we are really grateful that you're actually trying to get this solved. And we just want to say thanks, because it's been a really hard year of sometimes funding happening and sometimes not. In fact, one of the agents in Oklahoma City last month told me they feel like their check is bipolar because they never know where it's going to be at any moment. That just shouldn't be so. It just shouldn't be. So my challenge this week is the same as it is every week. Let's stay here until this actually gets done. Let's not walk away. Let's sit down. Let's figure out how we actually solve this. Let's not take 2.5 weeks to do a counteroffer to a legitimate offer from the White House. And can I just remind my colleagues, the White House's counteroffer expanded the use of body-worn cameras dramatically. It required ID on every single officer. These are all requests that my Democratic colleagues have made to be able to put in. Said that they won't do enforcement activities in sensitive locations. Make sure that all members of Congress can do oversight and get access to detention facilities. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. This is the list my Democratic colleagues all asked for, yet it never seems to be enough. And my fear is because the politics is better than the resolution. Well, it's not if you're a TSA officer. It's not if you're in the Coast Guard. It's not if you're a customs official. It's not if you're a Homeland Security investigator. Your family's not getting fed. It's not getting better for them. So the politics may be helpful for some. It's not helpful for all. So let's do at least, while we're in the debate, where we started this debate. We didn't start with a shutdown. We started with, okay, let's at least agree we'll keep the government open in all these areas while we're debating. We started with just 2 weeks here and said, 2 weeks, let's do a continuing resolution, let's keep our argument going, but pay everybody. That's where we began on this, but it seems like the easiest thing that we could literally do today and keep our argument going, because hopefully we're close, at least, on all this agreement, if we can ever get everybody to sit down in one room and to solve it. So I'm just going to ask to repeat what we did at the start of this. I asked the senator if he would modify his request so the Senate proceed immediately to consideration of calendar number 156 H.R. 4553, which is a 2-week continuing resolution for Homeland Security. I asked that Senator Warnock would substitute his amendment, number 4353, to be considered and agreed to, the bill be amended, be considered read a third time, passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made, laid upon the table.
Does the senator so modify his request?
I object.
Objection is heard to the modification. Is there objection to the original request?
Painfully so, Mr. President, I do object.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. Senator from Georgia.
Let me be very clear. Our differences here are differences in principle, and they have real consequences on the streets of America in real time right now. This is not just some theoretical argument. This is not about politics. This is about the people. I disagree fundamentally that we ought to have an unaccountable paramilitary force wreaking havoc on the streets of our country. ICE, as Trump has remade it, is killing American citizens. And I can't pretend like that's not happening. I stood where Renee Good was shot and killed while her vehicle was driving away. I stood where Alex Preddy lost his life while just trying to defend and protect a woman who we all saw being abused by ICE agents in real time. And so this idea that we either have to fund that or shut the government down is a false choice. Republicans have the majority in the Senate, they have the majority in the House, they have the White House. We can pay our workers right now. By the way, ICE already has more than enough money. They gave ICE $75 billion in the one big ugly bill. Let me put that in perspective. In terms of funding, ICE is now bigger than the United States Marines. And my Republican friends are saying to me, saying to my colleagues, that if you don't give this overgrown paramilitary force of masked agents jumping out of unmarked cars more money, we're going to leave TSA workers and others unpaid. I think that's patently unfair. I think we ought to fund the federal workers. We ought to fund FEMA, the Coast Guard, we ought to fund Homeland Security while we have a principled argument about what is happening with ICE, because what is happening there gets to the very basic things that I learned in my 9th grade civics class about the engagement between law enforcement and ordinary citizens every single day. And what we're witnessing in this moment is unacceptable. Pay the TSA workers. That is my offer, that is my request, and therefore I object to the senator's modification.